Welcome to SpunTales.com, where we spin tales from around the web. This week we continue the story The Falling by J.D. Phillips. An advanced copy of The Falling was provided to SpunTales with permission to read on air. Be sure to follow her at her socials at facebook.com/authorjd and twitter.com/JD_author. So far, the tests weren't going well. The x-ray proved too blurry to read, despite the fact Hartt hadn't moved when they were taken. His new doctor, a slightly overweight woman with short gray hair and kind eyes, had asked him to call her Pam. Felt it best not to waste time reordering them when it was Hart's skull and brain she was most concerned about. So Rita took him into a different area for something called an MRI. He knew before they even reached the room that this thing was the source of the uneasiness he'd felt upon arriving on this floor. The how or the why was unknown, of course, as he wasn't completely sure what an MRI even was, but he knew something bad would happen if he got near it, or worse even, allowed it to see inside of him. Pam walked alongside him as Rita pushed the chair closer to a room at the end of the hallway. He could feel a change in the air as the doctor opened the door. A surge of electricity that buzzed against his skin as well as beneath it and set his entire body on edge. The feeling only grew more intense once Rita pushed him inside, and he got his first look at the large machine looming over the narrow bed. They expected him to lie in the bed, so the bed could feed him into the machine, much as the table had before when it rolled him in and out of the cube. "I don't like this," he said, quickly shaking his head. "I understand how this might seem intimidating, given the night you've had," Pam told him. "Plenty of people who's been through less panic at the thought of getting scanned, but I promise, it won't be painful at all. All you have to do is keep still and let the machine take some images, and then you're done." "Done," he said. He didn't like the word done, though he was aware Pam hadn't meant it in the negative way. Just as Randy had been trying to comfort him earlier, so too was Pam. She was trying to comfort and encourage him to do what was needed to produce the results so she could write some orders and call it a night. She wasn't unkind, but she was tired. Dr. Dunrow's early departure had pushed her into overtime. He wanted to make Pam happy. He felt somewhat responsible for Dunrow's unexpected absence after all, even if he hadn't intended for what had happened to happen. He wanted to get the test over with so he could get to his room, away from the lights and the noise as well, but the thought of lying down in the bed and having his head stuffed into that machine. "Rita can hold your hand if you like," Pam said. "Hold my..." "No," he replied. "No, thank you." "He doesn't like to be touched," Rita said to the doctor. "Oh yes, that's right," Pam replied. "It's painful, correct?" That was partly correct, but something told him now was not the time to mention the images and the feelings that came with the pain. Pam wouldn't understand. He didn't fully understand. "Yeah, it hurts." "Well, you were submerged into icy water and kept in a freezer for a while," Pam said. "It isn't unusual that your skin and nerves are more sensitive. We'll add that to the list of things to keep an eye on, Pam intended that as something as a joke, but Hartt seen her jotting things down on her clipboard and knew she actually did have a list. She and the rest of the staff would refer to it often over the rest of his stay here, he imagined. Did that mean he'd have to find a way to clear all the items written upon it before they'd let him leave? "Can you move over to the bed, please?" Pam was asking. He could. Of course he could. He'd gotten the hang of standing up and sitting down fairly well, and didn't expect a quick step and move over to the bed to be overly difficult, but that meant getting near the machine, and that was the last thing he wanted to do. Even so, what choice did he really have? Pam was on her last thread of patience. She was tired. and she was concerned there may be something really wrong with his head. Delaying the inevitable would do little more than increase her stress and in turn his own. A technician named Tim came around to introduce himself once Hartt stood up and sat down at the edge of the bed. Tim would be in the other room, he explained, monitoring as he administered the scans. He'd keep a line of communication open to tell Hartt what to expect and to lend comfort if needed. Hartt appreciated the sentiment, but the fact that Tim, as well as everyone else, would be in another room to keep a safe distance from the machine didn't exactly set his mind at ease. Every fiber of his being screamed against lying back on the bed, but he did it anyways, shivering involuntarily as Rita and Pam took their leave to join Tim in the control room. Soon he heard Tim's voice over a speaker announcing they were about to begin, but there was something else as well. A low static that resembled a voice, a calling, or perhaps a warning. The air felt heavy once his head was under the machine. There were whirls and beeps, and Tim's garbled voice telling him to be still. He tried to listen, tried to do as he asked, but he felt every vibration and noise inside of his head, and it ached horribly. More than that, he smelled something burning. Even though he logically knew it shouldn't be the case, instinct warned him that the rays were cooking him from the inside out. "Burning," he whispered. "Please keep still," Tech Tim replied. "Everything's fine." Everything was not fine. Hartt closed his eyes and tried to believe Tech Tim was right, but things were bad. Something was horribly wrong, and if he didn't do something soon, "You've got to keep..." The static rose to a near-deafening wail, so shrill it drowned Tech Tim's voice out and completely made Hartt jerk his head off the pillow. He needed to cover his ears and get away from the noise and the burning rays of the machine. He needed to get out of here before the static found its way inside of him. He didn't realize he was shouting until a loud pop from the speakers rendered the entire room, machine and all, silent and still. The quiet was so sudden, it was painful, and yet he was only scarcely aware of the pain. The room had gone dark. The hall beyond was also dark, given the absolute lack of light around him, and he was too well aware of the closeness of the machine around him, trapping him in the same way the cube had, except now he felt hot rather than cold. He needed to escape. Pushing and clawing his way out of the tunnel-like machine took a great deal more effort than anticipated. Sweat dotted his upper lip and brow by the time he'd managed to scoot far enough down the bed to clear his head and sit up, but he made it. Not even the total dark which surrounded him could detract from the sweet relief of freedom. Outside, through the door, a chorus of voices and noises reached his ears. Startled gasps turned into confusion and back again as the generator failed to kick in. Too many people depended on the machines to live. The panic over what would happen if the electric went out and failed to turn back on was quite real. Seconds lasted an eternity. A number of phone calls were made on various cell phones. Then miraculously, emergency power finally kicked in every aspect of the area except the MRI room. Hartt could see the dim light creeping along the cracks between the door and the doorway. He remained in total darkness. And now that he'd managed to calm himself, he knew he wasn't alone. He was certain no one had entered the room after the blackout, yet over the ringing in his ears, brought on by the screeching static, he could hear some kind of skittering sound coming from somewhere across the room. It was slight, but definite, similar to fingernails tapping against a countertop. The sounds brought with them a rustling that occasionally resembled a harsh whisper, though Hartt couldn't make out any actual words. He stared in the direction of the sounds, squinting in the darkness as if that would somehow make him see better. Seconds later, he was certain he saw movement. A massive black, not quite in sync with the rest, billowing about like fog. A living, breathing shadow, independent from light and dark. It struck him that it was familiar, despite having no words to name or properly describe it. He followed the shape as it cut across the thin light streaming underneath the door. His entire body tingled with anticipation. He honestly wasn't certain whether it was excitement or fear, setting every last hair upon the back of his neck on end. But he had to see it through. He had to know why all of this felt familiar, when so far, nothing else had. Did the shadow know him? Was it what Randall had in mind when he felt certain someone was looking for him? Was that why the thought had filled him with so much dread? The rustling click and clack grew louder, nearer by the second, but it was difficult now to pinpoint the location. Beside him, behind him, definitely behind him, getting closer, too close. Close enough to reach out and grab hold, yet he didn't have it in him to try and move away. He hadn't ever taken but a few steps at a time after all. He didn't trust he'd be able to outrun the shadow even if he did. The click and the turn of the door handle startled him to attention. The skittering, rustling figure recoiled instantly as Pam came to check on him, and in doing so, destroyed the darkness the figure thrived upon. He was grateful for the interruption, even if he did have to protect his eyes from the light. "Are you all right?" she was asking. He wasn't certain. The light from the hall, while dimmer than usual, was still bright enough to assault his eyes, and his head was still throbbing. He didn't know what to say about the figure. It seemed to have left the room without Pam even noticing. "You're bleeding from your nose." She moved to fetch a few tissues. "Did you bump it trying to get out of the machine?" He didn't remember hitting anything. "I don't know." Thank you for listening to SpunTales.com. You just listened to The Falling by J.D. Phillips. SpunTales is a Heathen Digital podcast. If you'd like your story read on SpunTales, send us an email at info@spuntales.com. Thanks for listening.